As climate impacts intensify and governments continue to delay action, more people are turning to protest, disruption, and civil disobedience to demand change. When laws uphold injustice, is breaking them not only justified, but kind of necessary?
Hello and welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kristen Pugh, and I'm here with my co-host, Kyla Hewson.
On today's episode, we spoke with Dr. Kimberley Brownlee, Canada Research Chair in Ethics and Political and Social Philosophy at the University of British Columbia. She's also the author of several books, including Conscience and Conviction, The Case for Civil Disobedience.
In this conversation, Kimberley explains what civil disobedience is and presents her argument for why it's a moral right and sometimes a duty. We also discuss debates on civil disobedience and climate change prompted by the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and reflect on the current political climate, which is poignant. All right, let's go. What is civil disobedience and what are its core features?
Civil disobedience is a very tight, narrow type of breach of law. It's very constrained. The civil in civil disobedience is usually understood to refer to sincerity. Someone who engages in civil disobedience, they're serious about what they're doing. They're conscientious, they're principled, they believe in their cause. And they're also doing this communicatively. So they're not breaking the law in private, which is what people who engage in conscientious objection would be doing. Someone who, perhaps you have a nurse who objects to providing abortion care and quietly swaps assignments with a colleague, or you have a religious group that objects to a law, but they're not trying to change the law. They simply want to exempt their group from following the law. Then they would privately break the law, engaging in conscientious objection. Civil disobedience is more public, it's visible. And the people who engage in it, they are trying to start a conversation. They're trying to change laws, they're trying to change policies, but they're trying to do it through reasons, not through terrorizing the public or threatening politicians using extreme violence or terror to get their way. They are trying to engage as citizens.
So it's a form of breaking the law for a communicative reason, and it's not terrorism. I think that's really good. I wonder if you could give an example that helps people get a more concrete sense of what civil disobedience looks like, maybe in the climate context. So what might count as civil disobedience versus something that might cross the line into uncivil disobedience?
So the more constrained the action, the more likely it is to fit with the paradigm of civil disobedience. Mahatma Gandhi is often invoked as the paradigm example of a civilly disobedient actor. So he was committed to nonviolence. He claimed he didn't even feel violence or hatred in his heart toward the colonial British government in India. He used very simple, peaceful strategies. And so if you look in the climate context, or someone who acted in a similar way, the environmentalist Julia Butterfly Hill, she's a good example. So from December 1997 to December 1999, she lived in an ancient California redwood tree. She was 18 stories up. She was in all weathers, living on this small kind of 8x8 platform. The redwood tree she had nicknamed Luna. And she stayed there for 2 years so that the Pacific Lumber Company couldn't cut it down. And she only came down out of the tree once they'd reached an agreement that the company would not cut the tree down and they would in fact protect a 2-acre perimeter around it. So, her act, no terrorization, no violence, but very much sort of, in the way of this company. The tree was on company property. As part of the agreement, she did pay the company $50,000 for loss of revenue, but her action was as modest and constrained as possible while still being an act of trespass, an act of disruption. That fits pretty closely to the Mahatma Gandhi image of very narrow, serious, reflective breach of law. The interesting thing is philosophers debate whether civil disobedience has to be nonviolent by nature. John Rawls, it does. He gave us the most well-known story of civil disobedience in his book, A Theory of Justice. His account says to be a civil disobedient, you have to be using nonviolent methods. The difficulty is nonviolence is quite difficult to define. So, if I catapult a teddy bear at a police officer, was that a violent protest? If I pinch somebody, is that violence? Possibly what matters more is how much harm am I doing? Right? If I'm engaged in a roadblock and the ambulance can't get through, I'm doing a lot more harm than the catapulted teddy bear, even though my roadblock is not a violent act. So there's a lot of disagreement about just what the civility requires in terms of your strategy. Another interesting piece of Rawls's theory is that he said to be civil, you have to tell the police in advance that you're going to break the law. And that's also a bit of a strange condition because it's likely to be self-defeating. If I call up the police and say, I'm at 2 p.m. today, I'm going to break the law, there's a good chance I won't get to carry out my act of disobedience. So less demanding accounts, including my own, we say that you have to take ownership of your disobedience. You can't be evasive, but you don't have to acknowledge it in advance. It's enough if you say afterward, I did this and this is why.
Yeah, that does seem like an unnecessary constraint. Very little would happen if everybody had to notify the police in advance, I would imagine. So your research has it's articulated a general moral right to engage in civil disobedience, and we're going to get into that. But before we do, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how moral philosophy has approached the justification of civil disobedience historically.
So the term civil disobedience, it comes from an essay written by Henry David Thoreau. He gave a series of lectures in the late 1840s, and then he wrote an essay that was originally titled Resistance to Civil Government. And then after his death, the essay was retitled Civil Disobedience. And there's some dispute over whether he, prior to his death, authorized that change of title or whether it actually was his sister editing his papers who gave it the new title. So it's from him that we get this term. The practice, though, is as old as Socrates. Go back to ancient Athens, and you have Socrates who was wandering around trying to teach young people how to think and how to be virtuous. And he ends up in front of the Athenian assembly on trial for ostensibly exhorting false gods. And they're going to put him to death unless he agrees to stop what he's doing. And he says to them, if you release me, I will return to my practice of exhorting young people to lead a life of virtue. So it's from him, from that sort of vision of the society's conscience. We get this noble tradition. And Thoreau, in his own way, when he's talking about the ways we serve our society as citizens, he gives a special place to the people who serve with their conscience. So he says, many of us, we just serve with our bodies. We're part of the police force or the standing military, the National Guard. We're not really thinking. We're just doing what we're told. And he says those people could be compared with stones or logs or even dogs and horses. They're not thinking. And then there's another group of people who are serving with their heads. And these are the lawyers and the politicians. And he said the problem with only serving with your head is there's as good a chance you'll serve the devil as God. And then there's this small set of people who serve with their conscience. And he said often they're resisting their society. Often they're thought to be the enemy of the society, but they're in fact precious and priceless to society for keeping it in line with conscience. We have this, philosophers, we've sort of inherited this longstanding vision of civil disobedience as a noble practice, a principled form of non-cooperation. And what's been really interesting to see in recent years is how the the discussion has developed as new types of activism have become possible. So global disobedience, digital disobedience, there's many new ways of engaging in dissent that just weren't available to Gandhi and certainly not to Socrates.
I'd never heard of digital disobedience before. Could you give me an example?
So there's a debate about whether digital disobedience is properly civil disobedience, because a lot of people who engage in it don't announce themselves. So hacktivism, going into an authoritarian regime's government websites and shutting things down. There's also concern that some types of digital disobedience, the people doing it don't fully appreciate the full ramifications of what they're doing, right? You could end up messing up with the hospital's records, not just shutting down some part of the authoritarian executive. But yeah, using cyber attacks, using sort of tech savviness is a new type of disobedience. But as I say, there's a big debate about whether it earns the qualifier civil.
That's very cool. So it's a tradition that has existed for thousands of years, but it's also the tactics are always evolving. That's really interesting. I'm wondering, just before we get into the grounds on which your work justifies civil disobedience, there's sort of one line of thinking, as I understand it, that says civil disobedience is only okay in illiberal regimes. And if that's right, could you talk to me about what that idea is and why, if you disagree with it, why do you disagree with it?
Yeah, so the thought is that in a liberal society, you've always got good legal options to participate. A liberal democracy means there's a free press. It means there's protection of your freedom of expression. It means your members of parliament or your members of Congress are accountable to you, that you can vote, you can engage in public forums. And so there should be lots of good options to participate politically. And so the thought is, when there are all those good options and you have, in a way, no need to resort to breaking the law, any breach of law, it would be very unusual for it to be justified. Now, there's a couple answers to this. One is, is there any real world society that actually satisfies those conditions to be a liberal democracy? And even if we wanted to be a bit generous in how we understand a liberal democracy, civil disobedience can play an important stabilizing role. It can do what philosophers say is it can rectify democratic deficits. So, if there are topics we should be debating, but we're not debating, someone stepping just outside the law is going to attract the attention of journalists. And then, the politicians are going to have to answer questions about, okay, why is that person gluing themselves to a bridge? What is your party doing in response to their concern? So there can be a democratic function in civil disobedience to stabilize and to restart conversations that we should be having. It also can help to address a certain type of unfairness that creeps in, even in sort of the best approximation of a liberal democracy, and that is that not everyone has the same size microphone. People who have lots of money, people who have lots of political influence, they're usually the people who have a lot of investment in the status quo. They usually have the biggest microphones. And the people who are activists, who are dissenters, who are questioning the status quo, their microphone's usually a lot smaller, and they're usually pretty unpopular with the people in charge. And so giving people a small space to step outside the law in civil disobedience, that can help to make their microphone a bit bigger, sort of wake a society up to injustices that it's ignoring.
Let's turn to your work on the moral foundation for civil disobedience. Can you talk about where that moral right comes from?
In my book on civil disobedience, which is titled Conscience and Conviction, I make two big arguments in defense of civil disobedience. And the arguments, they each have a name that tracks the title of the book. So one of them is the conviction argument, and the other one is the conscience argument. The conviction argument, it focuses on us as expressive beings. We have deep beliefs, we have values, and we don't just want to live in line with our values quietly, right? We don't just want to be part of the religious group that is surreptitiously breaking the law in order to stay true to their own beliefs. We also want to be able to be seen to live in line with our beliefs. If our laws say, no, the only space we'll give you, the only exemption we'll make is for you to quietly, privately, sometimes not follow the law, then our state is asking a lot of us. It's asking us, in a way, not to be the expressive beings we are. And so my thought is that even if someone's cause is really objectionable, they should have access to a legal excuse based on the demands of their convictions. So, why were you parading, down this street in defense of a cause that our state views as xenophobic or white supremacist, and we've told you not to parade there? Why are you doing it? Well, the person could offer a legal excuse grounded in their belief. We might really object to their cause, but should make some acknowledgement of the importance of being able to express what you believe in public. Now, some people find that kind of argument a bit troubling, that in a way we only want to stand up for the good disobedience. We only want to defend the just causes. But the thing we forget, and this is what I'm about to say draws from John Stuart Mill, is that we have an interest in being exposed to views we don't like. So John Stuart Mill, in his book on liberty, he gives 4 reasons why we should embrace the collision of opinions. He says the reason we should allow people to say things we find objectionable, to defend views we find objectionable, is, first of all, their view might be true, their view might be false, but have a tiny kernel of truth in it. And even if their view is wholly false, we need to hear it in order to remember the arguments against it, in order to remember why we don't like it, why we don't believe it. And so he says, in order to avoid becoming the uncomprehending defenders of prejudice, we need to be exposed to all kinds of views, all experiments in living, even the ones we find really distasteful. So that's the conviction argument. The other one, the conscience argument, my position here is that, okay, we want something a bit weightier for the people who are genuinely standing up for justice. That they don't just have to give an excuse, a demands of conviction excuse, I broke the law because I really believed in this. We want to say that for some types of causes, it is clear that they are standing up for justice, that this is morally urgent, this is a crisis, and that they actually can offer a necessity defense. It was necessary that I break the law in order to try to mitigate this moral crisis. To defend your civil disobedience on the grounds of conscience, you first have to have a just cause, and it has to be a morally urgent situation, a moral crisis. The second condition is that your breach of law has to be a last resort in a specific sense. The legal means available to you, the otherwise reasonable legal options to participate, they are futile. They are getting you nowhere. And they could be futile just absolutely. This writing another letter to my MP is not going to do anything. Or they could be futile relative to the crisis. The climate crisis is growing at a faster rate than political change. I'm not able to get enough political will through writing yet another letter, that kind of thing, another legal protest. I need to do something that's going to attract more media attention, going to force politicians to answer me. And so my otherwise reasonable legal options, they are relatively futile. The crisis is moving faster than those options can address. So that's the second one, last resort. And then the third one is parsimony or modesty. that the breach of law picked is as modest as possible in order to make a difference.
Okay, so it seems like there are sort of two different conviction and conscience. Conscience is kind of a higher standard, but maybe more readily justifiable. Is that fair to say? Or
That's right. So someone like Martin Luther King Jr., he could have said, I've got a conscience argument for my breach of law. I'm standing up for Black people's rights to be a citizen. I'm resisting not just the Ku Klux Klaner, I'm resisting also the white moderate who is more in love with order than justice. I'm reacting to the white moderate who says to me, well, wait for a better season, wait for a more convenient time. I cannot wait, right? I am standing up for justice. We need a positive justice, not just a bare order where white people stay dominant. So yes, it's someone who can make a conscience argument can say, my cause of justice is clear.
thank you for outlining those different sort of justifications for civil disobedience. And I'm guessing that the conscience argument somewhat feeds into this next question, but is there ever a moral duty to engage in civil disobedience? And how would we know that we have that moral duty?
Yes, there definitely can be cases where we have a moral duty to engage in civil disobedience. There are different ways to recognize that there are morally urgent needs in the room. So the human rights framework is one reference point. There's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. There's the two international covenants. And those documents provide a decent list of the basic rights we have as human beings. And so when our government starts to stomp all over those rights, we're in the territory of morally urgent needs. Now, we're not the only beings that have rights. Thanks to Peter Singer and other defenders of the animal liberation movement, there's now a healthy story about the rights of animals or the interests of animals to be treated well. But we want to find some benchmark, some reference point for, okay, when is this a morally urgent situation? The British and Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, he identifies a way for us to know we're in a morally urgent situation. And what he focuses on is, what would future generations say about what we're doing? Is a future generation likely to condemn us for some practice of ours? It could be the climate crisis, which I'll say more about in a second. It could be, the mass incarceration system in the United States. It could be everything the Trump government is doing right now in terms of, decimating a lot of the federal agencies and the ripple effect that's going to have on so many people's lives. Appiah says there are three signs, at least three signs, that our society is doing something that future generations are likely to condemn. The first sign is that we know the arguments against what we're doing. We know the arguments against all of the ways that we are decimating the climate. We know the arguments against, honor killings of women. We know the arguments against outright bans on abortion. So that's the first sign. Do we really know the arguments? The second is that the people who are defending a certain practice, are they offering moral counter arguments, or are they instead invoking tradition or human nature or lifestyle? Are they saying, well, we couldn't ask people, not to drive a gas guzzling SUV because, people live far from their jobs and this is the Western lifestyle. Or, in terms of invoking tradition, well, we couldn't ask conservative families, not to severely punish their daughters because, a girl's chastity, that is tradition, that she be chaste, she be innocent. And if she's attacked or if she's somehow not chaste, well, that would be going against tradition if we didn't punish her. So the second point is, what kind of arguments are made to defend our practice? And then the third is, are we engaging in strategic ignorance? Are we all kind of burying our heads in the sand so we don't have to admit some hard truths. The burying the heads in the sand, a lot of that is happening in academia right now, particularly in the US, as academics adjust rapidly to the radical shift in policy by the US federal government, where it's now forbidden to care about diversity, inclusion, or equity. That these words are basically banned from grant applications, and that universities are required to fire their personnel who were trying to improve diversity and inclusion. And there's a lot of what M. Geeson has called anticipatory obedience, people sort of in advance getting themselves in line to follow the new order and avoiding the truths of what the new practice is actually doing. Some of the new policies are actually forbidding doctors, when they apply for grants, from using the word female in their grant application. And one doctor noted that her work focuses on the differences, the biological differences in men and women's immune systems. And so she basically can't apply for funding unless she's going to somehow go along with this new order and put her head in the sand about the sexism and the bigotry in the policies. So those are three signs that we're in a situation of moral urgency. We know it's wrong, we're making bad arguments to defend it, and we're basically putting our heads in the sand about our own complicity. And in the case of the climate crisis, the heads in the sand and the enormous evidence of the devastation it's just undeniable, and yet we plead ignorance.
That's a really great answer. Thank you so much. It really clarifies, and it's so simple.
Yeah, it gives what's I think a little bit terrifying about it is I can think of at least 5 or 6 issues that meet all of those standards. But for sure, climate change is one of them, as you said. So before we talk more about sort of the practice of civil disobedience in the context of climate change, I'm just wondering what you would say to people who argue that civil disobedience is undemocratic.
So the reason that objection is raised is the thought, sort of going back to what a liberal democracy means, is that if you step outside the law to defend your cause, you're giving yourself a freedom that other people are not giving themselves. So you're sort of improperly arrogating to yourself a space of participation when other people are binding themselves to follow the law and stick with the ordinary, legal marches, writing to the MPs, sticking to the legal channels of participation. And so there is a worry that this is really undemocratic. Now, the answer to it is that democracy is a work in progress. Votes have to be taken before discussions are concluded. And even when votes are taken, the discussion has to go on because needs change, circumstances change. And also, even in the best democracy, the conventional forms of engagement can break down. The government can really be the ones who are not following the rule of law. The philosopher of law, David Disenhouse, he has argued that civil disobedience can actually strengthen the rule of law. We tend to, if we see people engaging in civil disobedience, they're protesting where they shouldn't, or they do modest damage to property, certainly not any injury to persons. We tend to get nervous, right? Oh, okay, those people are not respecting the rule of law. But he says, actually, when someone's engaging in civil disobedience where the cause is clearly just, and climate activism, the cause is clearly just, he says, those acts of civil disobedience alert the public. They alert politicians and other authorities that the law is being used by powerful people as an instrument of great injustice. In the case of Canada, he says there's so much injustice in how the Canadian state is engaging with Indigenous peoples, how much stomping on Indigenous lands there continues to be, how much disregard for Indigenous guardianship and stewardship, how much aggression there is by Canadian police towards Indigenous protesters, and how much the Canadian state is enforcing settler colonial rules, and when doing so, disregarding commitments the state has made toward reconciliation and repair. So he says, civil disobedience can be a wake-up call that the state is failing to honor rule of law. We shouldn't look at the protesters on the street and assume that they are the culprits. They are, in a way, the canary in the coal mine, alerting us to a grave injustice.
We've established that civil disobedience isn't undemocratic and that there sometimes is a moral duty to engage in it, and probably climate change meets that standard. So I'm wondering, for listeners who might be thinking about that and sitting with it, what are a person's moral duties when they engage in civil disobedience?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So the first duty is personal responsibility. So taking responsibility for your own participation, being very aware of the group you're joining, the action you're undertaking, the repercussions and risks it might pose to other people. Being also very aware of the surrounding political context. So, government inaction is ongoing and very distressing. But the thing to be attentive to is, could an act of disobedience, could it be a distraction? Could it undermine other efforts? Could it add more noise in the media machine than would be helpful in this moment? So there's an element of dexterity and creativity and responsibility in this serious protester. Erica Chenoweth, she's a researcher of civil resistance, and she argues that at the moment that the missing key ingredient is government action. And she talks about ways that successful movements do manage to make moral progress. So she says peaceful resistance, very constrained, limited civil resistance, including civil disobedience, this kind of people power, this is the most effective way to bring about significant moral change. She talks about students and workers and children and people with disabilities, and lots of marginalized groups have successfully used civil resistance to push for better rights and fairer labor practices and to end civil wars and to counter authoritarianism. And she stresses their self-discipline and their creativity. So these successful movements, they start to grow. They start to become more diverse and large as they get going. They also tend to get key defectors. So people or institutions or businesses who do have an interest in the status quo, usually a money interest, if a movement can get those people on board, then they start to have leverage. They also, they're very dexterous in their methods. They use different types of pressure. They appreciate the value of economic pressure. So strikes, boycotts, other forms of economic non-cooperation can be quite effective. And the people stay committed for years. They know this is not a short-term thing. And one thing that's very striking, if you look at really successful organizations and lobbying movements, like in the US, the NRA, one reason they're credited with being so successful is they're calling their congresspeople day after day after day. So someone who wants to stand up and protect the climate needs to be in there with both legal and potentially civil disobedient methods day after day after day.
I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on how the diffuse nature of climate change might affect the tactics of civil disobedience that would be useful in this case. Because it strikes me that it's maybe more challenging to find targets in this context as opposed to an issue like segregation, where it's sort of easier to draw a straight line between the type of civil disobedience and the sort of moral claims that are being made. So are there any examples of civil disobedience on climate change that you would say are sort of particularly effective in demonstrating that link versus others that maybe aren't as effective?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, because if you want to argue necessity, right? My breach of law was necessary to prevent a crisis or to slow down a crisis. You are tasked with drawing a very tight link between your action and the crisis you're preventing or the crisis you're mitigating. And the problem with the climate crisis, it is enormous. It's happening on so many fronts. I was reviewing recently a short summary by David Benatar of just a list of the various ways we are doing damage. That extinction rates are 1,000 times faster than they would be without our interference. We're polluting air, lakes, oceans, rivers, causing a greenhouse effect. There are mudslides, there are wildfires, there are rising sea levels. There's so many ways in which we are causing enormous damage. North America has lost over 3 billion birds in the last 50 years, about 29% of the population. And so when those are the statistics, it's in a way sort of laughable for someone to say, my small act of civil disobedience, my refusal or my blocking this road, or my standing in front of that bank, my refusal to get out of this tree, that this was necessary to mitigate the climate crisis. It's not even a drop in the bucket in terms of response to the enormity of the crisis. And so what it suggests is that we need a different story about the kinds of morally urgent situations that could justify necessity, a necessary breach of law. There are other ways to try to make an argument, but they tend to be more of the excusatory form, where the law is put first and the person is excused rather than recognized as justified for breaking the law.
I'm wondering whether sort of the selection of target maybe goes to that argument as well. Is civil disobedience in the context of climate change maybe more justifiable when targeted at fossil fuel companies rather than maybe actors that are more sort of diffusely linked to emitting?
So certain types of laws, in a way, cannot be targeted by civil disobedience, or certainly not by direct civil disobedience. So any law where I would have to engage in gross wrongdoing in order to break it is not a law I can breach in civil disobedience. If the law forbidding murder, there's no way to directly civilly disobey that law. So if the punishment for murder were excessive, I couldn't engage in direct disobedience in order to object to that punishment. I'd have to engage in indirect disobedience. I'd have to break some other law, like a trespass law, in order to make my objection. So there are certainly limits, some just content limits on what I can do in relation to the law as civil disobedience. With respect to the targets, there are definitely some off-limit targets. Certainly anything that would pose risks to children is a legitimate off-limit target. And also anything that would give a hint of inconsistency, right? So, sort of coming back to the roadblock example, if my group champions human rights or is an environmentalist group that champions all life, and then we block a highway without consulting the emergency services beforehand to ensure they can get through, we're raising a question about our sincerity. How committed are we to our official campaign if we're willing to risk the thing we value in order to draw attention to our cause? The targets of our tactics say something about how much we truly value the cause we have. And then also there can be reasons to be dexterous strategically when the strategies we're using are proving to be ineffective. So Extinction Rebellion, they announced a little while ago that they were going to move away from some of their more eye-catching strategies, breaking windows and blocking traffic, because those strategies were alienating the public, and they were going to target businesses instead. And I haven't heard as much about them over the last year or two, but at least I'm not hearing criticism of them, and that they're being too radical or they're somehow not consistent with their commitments because of how they were approaching their strategies.
Extinction Rebellion is a really good example. And I guess, I'm kind of wondering, when civil disobedience, or if civil disobedience isn't leading to meaningful change, what comes next?
Some theorists say that a certain likelihood of success is a condition for justified civil disobedience, that if your cause, if the case is hopeless, you really shouldn't be breaking the law. Others say, and I would put myself in this second group, that in a way, when the situation is most hopeless, that is when civil disobedience is most justified. There's a part of John Rawls's view is that, sort of in addition to having a just cause and this being, a last resort in the sense that reasonable legal alternatives just aren't working, he also has a condition that a good civil disobedient will discuss with other activist groups. They will talk to other dissenters before they break the law. And that's so that they don't collectively put too much pressure on the public's sense of justice, and they don't put too much pressure on the Constitution. So there's some thought that liberal democracies they're fragile, they're precious, they can be undone, and dissenters need to be mindful of that. And again, sort of looking at everything that's going on in the U.S. right now, we certainly need dissent, we need responses, but it has to be dexterous because that constitutional order is already enduring an earthquake. And thoughtless dissent could, in fact, make things worse.
Yeah, gosh, it's such a good point in the American context. I imagine so tricky for folks. I'm wondering, in the climate movement, the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline has generated quite a lot of debate, and it essentially critiques the pacifism of the climate movement, including civil disobedience, and it argues essentially for the validity of property destruction as a tactic. And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on that argument.
So there are some philosophers who make a case for what they call uncivil disobedience. Candice Delmas, she's a philosopher in the US at Northeastern University. She has a book, A Duty to Resist, where she defends uncivil disobedience. So she says, instead of trying to broaden the definition of civil disobedience so it might include property damage, let's sort of call this what it is. This is uncivil, right? This is destruction of property. This would include riots, guerrilla protests, graffiti, ecotage, like tree spiking, animal rescue, sabotage, the things that are covert, deliberately violent, risky, evasive, offensive. She argues there is a case to be made for those when more gentle, staid practices like civil disobedience are not proving sufficiently effective quickly enough. My worry is that those kinds of methods can drown out the moral appeal. They can be distracting. So the media can get more caught up in the method used rather than the cause that was being supported by the method. And so sometimes the most powerful types of dissent can be incredibly simple, incredibly pure. It was really striking. This wasn't at that moment an act of civil disobedience, but it was very striking. The day after Donald Trump had his inauguration, the Bishop of Washington, Marion Budde, from the pulpit made a direct appeal to Donald Trump in a service that he show mercy to trans people, mercy to immigrants, mercy to families who are now fearing that they would be separated or parents would vanish. She was on every news station being interviewed, and the New York Times profiled her very highly. And it was just this very simple act of dissent that you couldn't get distracted because there was nothing gratuitous about it. I say it was only sort of, it wasn't civil disobedience at the time, but the direction the U.S., sort of the authoritarian fumes wafting out of the U.S. right now, very soon you could imagine certain kinds of criticism of the administration being prohibited.
And on that point, we're in pretty bleak times right now. And I'm wondering if there's any advice that you would offer for folks who are trying to navigate their moral duties in this really precarious moment.
So it's very important to continue to expose ourselves to good ideas. to remember, what was a few weeks ago sort of ordinary liberal commitments to decency and human rights and equality and diversity and inclusion. Suddenly, those ideas are sounding edgy, sounding shocking, particularly in the United States. And but Canada, we're not immune. We get their news. We are affected. Our policies, we adjust in response to them. Certainly, researchers are having to rethink their grants in partnership with American scientists. So it's crucial to ensure we are talking to people who are committed to good values. And if we wish we were doing more, to respond to the climate crisis, for example, we need to pay attention to who we're hanging out with. It is easier to make a change in our practices if we spend time with people already walking the walk that we want to walk.
I really appreciated the way that Dr. Brownlee talked about the difference between civil disobedience and being a conscientious objector. And I really like that she used the story of Julia Butterfly Hill going up 18 stories up in a redwood tree for 2 years, which we read about in the Overstory, which I think we released as a Patreon episode. So listeners, go to our Patreon if you want to hear Kristen and I talk about like a 900-page book about trees.
A strangely gripping 900-page book about trees.
Kristen loved it. I also thought it was good.
Yeah, civil disobedience, it is a topic that we have been trying to do on this podcast, I think, basically for 3 or 4 years now. And it was really, really hard to find guests that were willing to speak on it. So trust a philosopher to be willing to talk about moral philosophy. Thank you so much, Kimberly.
Yeah, because it's a really interesting conversation to have on a podcast, because this just lives on indefinitely forever and ever. And if Kristen and I ever do anything else, this will be the episode that everyone comes to and is like, they're dissidents.
I think we're already going to get put in the gulags, unfortunately. But
no. I liked the examples that she talked about. I wanted to just take a second to shout out Greta Thunberg, as always, for being an absolute legend. Protesting the way that she does. I think it was getting a lot of momentum before the pandemic really upended a lot of the work that people had been doing up to 2019.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it seems as though we've started to see a resurgence of engagement generally. Climate change has really taken a back seat to other concerns. But just as I think the climate movement had done some really good work in like 2018, 2019, 2020, to build solidarity and to also link its issues to economic justice issues. So I really hope that economic justice organizations will start to kind of return the favor a little bit.
I had some questions that I was listening to this and I was writing them down as we talked. And, I have to wonder how factors like race, class, nationality affect who can safely engage in civil disobedience, because how they're treated by the state if they're caught varies wildly. I also think that governments often respond to civil disobedience, especially with the climate movement, weirdly, with criminalization and strange acts of repression. You just have to look at any Indigenous sort of blockade in recent memory within Canada to see that happening. So it's like, what are the ethical implications of that? And does it change like the moral calculus for people considering civil disobedience? I mean, Alberta and BC are fully reevaluating how to respond to civil disobedience. Ottawa had that convoy. I'm sure that there's conversations about that are happening.
I mean, I think you're right that there are some people who have more privilege and for whom it is easier to engage in civil disobedience, or at least safer. Civil disobedience, as Kimberly explained, it always comes with cost. And like most of the times, you have to sort of be willing to accept that. But this is really a debate that I think is for primarily privileged white climate activists and regular people who care about climate change. It's a very challenging moral question to be confronted with. But Kimberly laid out a pretty strong argument for the conditions under which civil disobedience is a moral duty. And climate change would seem to meet all of those conditions. So I suppose I'll leave it at that.
I'm going to go ahead and take a risk and say, start small, like I'm going for it. Get some stickers from Greenpeace. They've always got stickers ready to pick up. And then just start putting stickers up around your neighborhood as just like a small little act of vandalism that hurts nobody. And, dip your toe in the water. I also feel like I won't get in trouble for promoting that on a podcast that lives indefinitely. It's probably not even a crime.
Kyla canceled for Stickergate.
If you see stickers in my neighborhood, listener, it was me. That's not true. There's a lot of people in my neighborhood who put up stickers. Shout out to you guys. You're the real MVPs. It's important for listeners to kind of sit with what the conversation was and consider what you want to tell your grandkids in 100 years, or if you plan on having those, or just what side of history do you want to be on? It's a question that I've been asking myself, especially since this episode, and it's something that I've been reflecting on. I don't have the answer, or else I would tell you right now. I think it's the sort of thing that everyone has to come up with an answer for themselves, unfortunately. But we are by no means the most radical podcast on the Harbinger Media Network. So if listeners want somebody who's a little bit more spicy, more hot-headed, more quick to tell you what to do, there are plenty of fantastic progressive Canadian podcasts that you can check out. They are all at the Harbinger Media Network at harbingermedianetwork.com. Thank you so much for listening. We will catch you on the next episode. We are grateful to be learning and unlearning on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as well as the ancestral unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We encourage listeners to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the history of their own territory and to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.